Hello and welcome to Political Business. I'm Nathan Parsad-Wyatt, former Conservative Party candidate and advisor.
And I'm Kevin McKeever, a one-time Labour parliamentary candidate, staffer and advisor to some of Britain's biggest brands.
We've both stood for elections, we both advised on how to win elections, and our advice continues here on this podcast as the landscape around politics shifts. Whether politically, economically, socially or technologically, old approaches no longer cut through. Welcome to Political Business.
On today's episode, we've had a whole range of new economic data this week. Government borrowing has hit record levels, inflation is held at 3.8%, and more kites are flying about what taxes the Chancellor is going to raise in the upcoming budget. We'll consider the government's pivot to blame Brexit for economic difficulty. And Rachel Reeves was in the West Midlands this week hosting an investment summit. She's promised a blitz on business bureaucracy to cut red tape and aim to save British companies nearly £6 billion a year.
And the political narrative of the next few days will be set with the Senedd by-election in Caerphilly. Polling suggests it'll be won by either Reform UK or Plaid Cymru. We'll consider what this means for the political scene. Getting straight into it then, Kevin, we've had the inflation figures just this morning, remaining stable at 3.8%. And I saw that was largely lower than expected food prices, with even though petrol prices were slightly higher, so lower than expected.
The Treasury, of course, were expecting or pricing in 4%.
Is that what they thought?
That's exactly right. So 0.2% gift back from the Office of National Statistics.
Well, a win's a win at the moment, particularly in the run-up to the budget,
Absolutely.
When you consider that borrowing figures also came out this week, and they've hit a record high of £99.8 billion, which was 11.5 billion more than the same 6-month period of 24, and the second highest April to September borrowing since monthly records began. So pretty bad news for the Chancellor heading into the budget at the end of the month.
Absolutely. Let's take a moment to reflect on those borrowing figures. I think we've all got so used to just, spouting these big numbers without actually reflecting on what it means. The government is annually borrowing, touching on £100 billion. I think it's going to be 110 for the year. The projection may well go up. We spend about 100 billion on debt interest.
Yeah.
So we're borrowing now to pay debt interest. So anyone that thinks that the government, particularly on the left, can get away with not addressing spending is living in cloud cuckoo land. The economy is in a very tough place. Now, the Treasury know this. Rachel Reeves knows this. But I'm pretty sure a lot of Labour backbenchers are feeling that they don't want to know this. And also, we'll come and talk about this later in a different context. But noises from people like the Greens who just say, well, just borrow more, it's fine, I think are causing trouble in Parliament.
Well, it's the same principle of the old Liz Truss days, isn't it? Where you can, whether you're borrowing to spend more money or whether you're borrowing to fund tax cuts, unsustainable borrowing, eventually you're going to get found out, and nobody is going to reward a government who has a debt crisis on their hands.
Absolutely. And I'm going to be slightly controversial and say there's one person I agree with in their commentary on debt and why it should be a bigger issue, and that is David Cameron. What a man I agree with very often. But he said, I think it was this week or last week, he was at a conference. He got a bit of media coverage, but I picked it up and watched the full clip on YouTube. He said that he doesn't understand why this debt issue is not a big intergenerational problem for younger voters. So, of course, what we're doing as a nation is mortgaging young people's future, partly at the expense of maintaining policies like the triple lock for pensioners.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Of course, that was the defining mission of the Cameron government, set by George Osborne alongside him, and maybe puts pay to the commentary that we had at the time from a lot of Labour activists and the leadership that austerity isn't in fact a choice, and maybe this government might have to pursue a version of austerity on its own.
Well, I don't think that's the case at all. And in fact,
call it something different.
And in fact, the OBR, by all accounts, is going to point out, we'll come on to Brexit in a sec, but actually everyone's talking about, the pivot to Brexit, and we'll come on to it, but actually also in the news and the chatter in Whitehall around Rachel Reeves being more aggressive on explaining away some of the reasons for our economic performance is the long-term damage that austerity has done for productivity. So I don't think I'm going to accept austerity was a good thing. And of course, reducing debt as a percentage of GDP is one of Rachel Reeves's golden ironclad fiscal rules. So it's not sound money is not a left or right issue. Well, it's a right and wrong issue.
I think it's something that you cannot ignore when you're in the Treasury. And like you said, I think the leadership and Rachel Reeves potentially understands this, but the problem is managing lots of backbenchers. But that's the economic challenge heading into the budget, which is, stabilised inflation potentially, a high borrowing bill, economic growth that's more sluggish than Rachel Reeves would certainly like, but of course all of us in the country would like, and indeed a volatile global backdrop as well. So difficult economic decisions to be made as we head towards November 26th, as I'm sure we will come back to in coming episodes. But what's the political strategy here? I mean, we've had the conference season where Nigel Farage loomed large over Keir Starmer's speech, very much a choice between Nigel and Keir Starmer, and that's setting sort of almost a battle line between a version of moderate leadership against what he perceives to be extreme leadership from Nigel Farage. But actually Brexit has come back into the fray this week with the rumours that Rachel Reeves is effectively going to say that Brexit, along with the austerity point that you made previously, has caused all the problems that we're dealing with now and has set the scene for her budget. It's interesting talking about Brexit again. We haven't raised it as an issue, though it's been looming over the UK economic picture for some time. Do you think this strategy will work, blaming Brexit? And I know they're getting the nuance of not the decision itself, but how it was implemented. But do you think blaming Brexit and bringing that into the conversation is going to give the government the political get-out-of-jail-free card?
Well, I'm not sure if it's a get-out-of-jail-free card, but I think there should be points in politics and in life for telling the truth. And Brexit is the economic impact that dare not speak its name over the last few years, particularly in the Labour Party. You remember the Ming Vase strategy?
I do.
Which was how Labour...
Don't drop it.
Absolutely. And inherent key to the Ming Vase strategy was not winding up or the target what we call hero voters. And those are voters who had left Labour for Boris Johnson's Tories in 2019. Some of them actually left us in 2015, but we're not allowed to talk about that. Left us in 2019 and now are kind of reform vulnerable, or even some of them will have crossed the Rubicon to voting reform. So in order to appeal to them, there was a Murta issue. Do not talk about Brexit. And in fact, just a little aside, a friend of mine who is now in government, who was selected in a retirement seat, was on BBC Radio, insert small British county here, mentioned that he hoped at some point in the future we'd rejoin the European Union, and 2 hours later got a call from Morgan McSweeney with a bit of a hairdryer treatment about breaking the line. So that was a good, nice anecdote about actually Morgan was serious, and it came from him and Deborah Mattison and Paul Ovenden, late of Number 10. Do not talk about Brexit. Now, of course, lots of people within the party were then saying, well, we need to talk about Brexit, both in a social context, and that's not for today, but particularly in an economic one. I think it was at the time, the OBR projected that Brexit would cost us 4% of GDP. Actually, what we're probably going to hear from the OBR and the Chancellor later this month is that it was even greater than that. So 4% and 100 billion a year, potentially, even more. But to go back to your question, is it the right political strategy? Well, again, start where the truth is. But this has caused divisions politically in Westminster. So some in the cabinet are saying this is absolutely what we should be talking about. Definitely on some on the soft left of Labour's backbenches, saying we have to put our name on it. My constituents in London constituencies, are fully aware that Brexit's a mistake, whereas others who are potentially a more kind of Middle England and north of England constituencies are saying that this is going to light a touch paper, and we're going to. Someone said to me, Nigel Farage will scream blue murder, saying, "Here we go, the Brexit betrayal." And I think the challenge we're talking about Brexit and saying, as you said rightly, the political strategy is nuanced. It's not that Brexit, the decision was wrong, but it's the implementation potentially. But that's of course exactly what Farage says. Exactly, and here's why I don't think the strategy will work. Partly because I can see the logic behind it. 6 out of 10 voters think that Brexit was a mistake.
even more think that it's had an economic impact. There's consensus around...
Well, it has had an economic impact.
Although some economists this morning in Bloomberg I was reading were saying very much that actually a lot of the productivity problems can be traced back to the 2008 crash, and that this in itself isn't necessarily the root cause. But I think we all accept that it's had an economic impact, and the government was elected on a mandate to strengthen our relationship with the EU whilst maintaining those red lines of customs union, single market, and not going formally back into it, and free movement, exactly. So, but I think the challenge here is that Farage also knows that the situation's moved on. He is very aware that Brexit is not the number one issue, but the other issues that Labour may say stem from Brexit are, so cost of living crisis, raising taxes, low productivity. Yep. And I think the challenge for the government is to out-communicate Nigel Farage on those issues when increasingly people don't really care about what the root cause was. They question why Labour said they were going to solve this if they were to win an election and haven't been able to, and are now talking about Brexit being the key issue. I think in many ways it presents more of a challenge for the Conservatives because actually, whether it's austerity, whether it's Brexit, whether it's taxes going up, borrowing during the pandemic, or the aftermath of the 2008 crash, what they're effectively returning to in a more nuanced form is it's all about the last 14 years. I think you speak to some Conservative MPs and you ask whether that's credible now, it's 16 months into the government, where more and more people are saying, well, have you nearly had enough time to start solving these problems yourself? They don't think it's credible. And they would say that, wouldn't they?
And that's wishful thinking. How long into the 2015 Parliament were Tory MPs talking about Labour maxing the nation's credit card, which, to its credit, really wound up the Labour opposition at the time? I think you're right. I think the challenge is that the government has to out-communicate, particularly reform. The government has not been particularly known for its sharp comms.
No.
I'll just park that there. But actually, focus groups and polling show that it's the last Tory government, and in particular Boris Johnson, who now gets the blame for Brexit mistakes and Brexit handling. So actually, it's probably not unhelpful to reform, to blame the Conservatives. It's not particularly helpful, but it's not that helpful for Labour.
Yeah, I agree.
Keir's defined himself directly, probably rightly electorally, against reform. So making sure the Tories, who are on their back, stay on the ground is probably not the best use of Labour's political capital. It'll be interesting to see how business responds to Brexit being blamed, because the natural question, all the pieces that will be done in the run-up and post-budget, and I'm sure the Treasury must have some businesses lined up, or else why would you be talking about it, to actually say, yes, this is the cost of Brexit. And of course, they were also stung after the referendum, particularly after the Scottish referendum, that none of them really got involved in the Brexit debate. It'd be interesting to see if anybody now says, this is the opportunity to we need to have a even deeper relationship with the European Union, and if anybody calls for us even to rejoin.
Well, I think that's the natural follow-up question, isn't it? If the government identifies that Brexit is the core problem and is saying very clearly that this has contributed towards a lack of productivity, a lack of economic growth, the natural follow-up to anyone in the electorate, to the government is, well, okay, what are you doing about it? Should we rejoin the EU then? And is that a debate they really want to get into?
Do not want to
have a mandate to get into based on commitments made in the manifesto. So,
but that's because, I might be being overly cynical here, but the objective of blaming Brexit partly for our current economic hole is not in order to overcome that, but in order to force the OBR to score the impact of Brexit much more highly.
If only the government had a majority and could do something about the OBR.
It's almost like the OBR are, ruling the country. It's like a ruling council.
Well, I said to you the other day, we were talking about this, that at the end of the previous Conservative government, I would have Conservative MPs, people in the Treasury message saying, we hate the ABR, we need to abolish it, it's causing massive restrictions in our ability to make our own independent financial decisions, burnt by the Liz Truss era of government. Rachel Reeves comes in, puts it on a pedestal, puts it very much firmly at the heart of her fiscal credibility in legislation. Sensible political reasons, for sure. But now it's a number of Labour MPs and senior Labour officials playing back exactly the same arguments that the Conservatives were.
Absolutely.
It is one of the biggest debates, I think, in our economic management, and we'll see how that progresses. But
government is elected to govern, and actually waiting for the sages of the OBR to hand down their views from their small set of offices, I think they're still in the MOJ building, is just bizarre.
Quite. I agree. Rachel Reeves held the first regional investment summit in Birmingham on Tuesday this week, and used it as an opportunity to say the government will be scrapping pointless paperwork, needless form filling for small businesses. I think we've heard a lot of this in the past about reducing red tape around businesses. It is one of the levers the government can pull at the moment in the absence of any other kind of fiscal opportunities to increase or decrease public spending or taxation. And there was a number of private sector investment that was announced alongside it. This comes off the back, I think, of the London investment summit that they did this time last year.
That's right, which had 63 billion pledges of investment.
Yeah, the point is these things are a good opportunity, I think, politically to get to reset the narrative for the government, get a lot of people together and say, look, there are businesses that are prepared to invest in the UK. It's not all doom and gloom. And I think Rachel Reeves specifically has always called for greater private sector investment into the economy. So it was a bit of I think it passed a lot of people by publicly, but it was probably more important behind the scenes.
Exactly.
But what have you heard from Labour MPs and others about how it went?
Well, I talked to a couple of clients who were there yesterday, both who were on the financial services side and on the infrastructure side. And they said that actually it was a great event. And the quote was from one of them, "We cannot have enough of these events." They said that the ministerial teams were walking the floor, were accessible, were positive, and there was a considerable show of commitment, particularly from Peter Kyle and his team. And they also said that the national political representation was fantastic, and they want more of it. Just that level of to be able to have those unchoreographed actual conversations rather than set piece ministerial meetings where everyone's reading out, minister reading off their civil service prepared notes. And also on the regional element, there was a lot of praise for Richard Parker, the Mayor of the West Midlands, and his team. That actually they really did put the West Midlands best foot forward, made the case to Birmingham and the greater region. And I think the next one up in the northeast next year.
Is that where it is?
I think so. It was seen as a really effective tool to promote the government, talk about investment in different asset classes, have access to senior ministers, and also to then have a singular focus on the West Midlands. So I think that went down really well. But actually, this might have passed the Westminster lobby by. This wasn't an event for them, and you've got to look at the impact in this case the West Midlands, the regional impact. And this is a big summit to have. And I was just looking at the headline on the Birmingham Mail: "Thriving West Midlands give an 800 million boost following major investment summit." That is the sort of headline you want when you're doing, in your regional media. And I think they'll see that as a success in the Department of Business and Trade and the Treasury. And, that is probably testament as well to the work of Richard Parker and the wider combined authority team in the West Midlands, who really, by all accounts, did a great job pushing the Birmingham and the West Midlands. And I think when we have the next regional summit next year, I think this is a great base on which to build.
It's a really good advert for the Metro Mayors, actually, and the devolution agenda, for them to take some ownership over the region and be able to pull all of these different pieces of investment together with the Treasury supporting at a national level. But it is interesting that the headline that the government clearly wanted to get at a national level was about this red tape saving, was about the fact that they're backing business in this budget, and again pushing the OBR to almost score the red tape reductions in an effort to boost the headroom that the Chancellor may have as she goes into the budget. But previous attempts to score red tape cuts tried by George Osborne, the OBR refused to do it then. And I think that the Cameron government claimed they were going to get 10 billion in red tape savings, yet investment fell. So I think it is tricky. It goes back to that. Who is the government talking to? Is it talking to the OBR or is it talking to the British public?
Well, and also, look, everyone likes to talk about cutting red tape, and everyone likes to talk about cutting government waste. If only it were that easy. I remember one of the first sets of issues I worked on in public affairs was then Blair government's red tape challenge under the Cabinet Office, where everyone got to submit their proposals for a bonfire of red tape. Now, the challenge with that is that everybody thinks that issues close to their heart are important regulatory measures, and that issues that don't impact their business, therefore, are irrelevant red tape. Here's a good example, right? The Building Safety Act and the Building Safety Regulator has placed over onerous burdens, arguably, on the residential building development sector, particularly in the capital. For some people, that is seen as overly onerous red tape. For others, these are measures which protect the industry and people from a potential second Grenfell. That's quite an extreme example. But the fact is, if there's so much red tape floating around that everyone thinks should be cut, and there's a consensus about that, why hasn't it happened already?
Well,
quite laudable exercise. But I do wonder when governments start talking about waste and red tape, have we scraped the bottom of the barrel?
Well, it goes back to that old thing that Margaret Thatcher used to say, which is I can find hundreds of MPs who tell me I should save money, but none of them want it in their own constituencies. At Lowick Hedgery, we help our clients make sense of a complex world and get things done. Whether it's shaping policy, delivering major projects, or managing your reputation, we bring together deep experience and fresh thinking to get results that matter.
And now you hear it every week on our podcast. Subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, YouTube Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll drop into your feed every week.
We've got a big electoral test this week.
Yes. So we've got the Caerphilly by-election on Thursday, which is for the Senedd, which is the devolved Welsh Assembly. The result is going to be closely watched because we've got local elections, of course, in England in May, as well as elections for the whole of the Senedd and the Scottish Parliament too. The May elections will be a flashpoint of jeopardy for the Prime Minister and also, of course, Kemi Badenoch. But going back to Caerphilly, the polls aren't great.
No.
I think the last one that we saw had Labour on 12%. This is a two-horse race now between Reform and Plaid Cymru. And actually, Plaid, pretty much of all the nationalist parties, particularly compared to the SNP, Plaid have historically actually underperformed. Remember, Labour's had control of the Senedd since devolution, and in Caerphilly, between the Assembly seat and the parliamentary seat, Labour's been in control for a century.
You're doing some good expectation management for the Labour Party there, aren't you? By not even painting it as a contest that Labour's in.
Absolutely. Look, at this point, let's just give you I know the lines will be going to backbenchers. At this point in the Parliament, with a government making tough decisions, it's totally unreasonable to be inflating, a potential Labour share of the vote. The fact is, people want to give the government a kick in, and you know what? Come Friday morning, the government's going to be listening, and they're going to have heard. And they're going to respond. So, absolutely. But you know what's absolutely
put you
shocking?
On the broadcast round on Friday morning.
I've done a lot of pre-by-election expectation management, and my favourite ones are when the lines to take change midway through the broadcast, which we had in 2019. So Plaid 38%. But what's interesting is who's going to those voters. So Reform being on 42% means that they're picking up obviously a lot of former Labour voters. I mean, we used to weigh the votes in Caerphilly for the Labour Party. So there's a lot of former Labour voters, but actually, interestingly, it's the age demographics that are really stark here. Older people, particularly those 45, 50 plus, are going in droves in this by-election to Reform, and it's younger people who are splitting to Plaid. Someone said to me, it's a bit like what's happening in parts of England, except you substitute Plaid for the Greens.
Yeah, and the Conservatives aren't really running a campaign here at all. In fact, some senior Conservatives have told their voters to vote Reform.
Jacob Rees-Mogg
just last week was talking about that. I do think that there's some concern in Reform circles that expectation management is completely the wrong way that they're set to walk this. They're worried if the result isn't as decisive.
If I was Reform, you'd want 50% share of the vote minimum.
Well, again, you would
anything
else is failure.
Is a failure.
But look, I think it's pretty bad for Labour if they don't win it, but it's priced in. I think, but it does set the scene ahead of the budget, ahead of next May. Those themes that we constantly return to week after week on this podcast, because ultimately those are the big tests, and it doesn't seem that anything the government's doing day to day is shifting that overall narrative at the moment. And similarly for the Conservatives, it's still Reform show another few months on.
Absolutely, and we'll see whether or not blaming Brexit and therefore blaming Nigel Farage works. We've had the Farage boats, which I thought actually went down quite well, but
I don't think it did with anyone.
For reasons unbeknownst to anyone apart from number 10, they talked about pinning the boats was probably flying a kite about the wider Brexit conversation. I think what will be fascinating will be how the government, number 10, judges whether or not that new comms approach is successful, and then if they stick to it, because the comms direction's been changing all the time. And, on Friday and over the weekend, there will be people in the Parliamentary Party in Wales and outside saying this result is an example of why we need to go back to our roots, why we need to talk more about green issues, why we need to be, we need to be more soft left, why we need to be more Ed Miliband. And there'll be others saying this is why we need to be, manning the barricades and pushing into reform territory, and we need to out Blair. And that is arguably what's happening in number 10 at the moment.
The debate continues. I think you're right, though. Choose a message and stick to it should be the government's lesson. I think the electorate haven't heard it until you've repeated it hundreds of times. And so, frankly, it does seem to change on a monthly basis. Kevin, what's our advice for this week?
I think the first thing is hold your nerve when it comes to reading the papers and budget speculation. There are more kites to come. So we've got, still got a month to go before the actual budget is tabled in Parliament. So unless you're a lawyer, you are going to get shafted with tax rises. We're reliably informed this morning. Hold your nerve and take most of the budget speculation with a pinch of salt, but accept that it's going to be tough and it's going to be a very difficult budget.
The second thing is that if you weren't involved in regional summits but want to find out more about them and how they work, then get in touch with us. We can connect you to the right people.
Absolutely. And then finally, watch out over the weekend for everyone claiming that the result in the Caerphilly by-election explains why their worldview is right, whether that's on the left and the right of the Labour Party or indeed the left of right of politics generally. By-elections are great for proving why one is correct.
Thanks for joining us on Political Business, where we give you our trusted advice in the changing landscape all around us.
To get more of what you've just heard, subscribe to the podcast and join us each week. Look us up online, as on LinkedIn, and find out more about what we do. Speak to you next week.
Bye now.